अच्छा जी, तो कैसे हैं सब लोग? अ, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। कैसे हैं सब लोग? उम्मीद करता हूँ कि ठीक होंगे। तो जैसे कि मैंने कहा था कि हम जो है कोशिश करेंगे एफओएमसी में लाइव आने की। तो उसी तरह जी, हमें जो है लाइव के लिए अभी चांस बोल रहे हैं, मौका बोल रहे हैं, जो भी आप बोलते हैं, तो हमें मौका मिल चुका है। उस हवाले से अगर हम देखें अभी, तो जी न्यूज़ आने वाली है एफओएमसी की, तकरीबन जो है उसमें अभी पड़ा हुआ है। तकरीबन कितना बनता है, अभी 40 हो रहे हैं तो 20 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं। तब तक मतलब न्यूज़ आ जाए, न्यूज़ आने के बाद देखते हैं क्या होता है। और रही बात इस ट्रेड की जो हमने उस टाइम ली थी, आपको पता होगा, तो ये हमारी ट्रेड जो है विनिंग गई हमारे टारगेट के बाद। यहीं से दोबारा इसमें एक पंप आया, उसके बाद डंप आया। तो फिलहाल यहाँ पे एक रेंज में जो है रुकी हुई है मार्केट। इस वजह से फिलहाल किसी किस्म की अभी हम जल्दबाजी नहीं कर सकते, क्योंकि वैसे भी आपको पता है मेरा तो जो फंडेड अकाउंट है, तो मुझे उन लोगों ने जो है मना किया हुआ है। ठीक हो गया। बाकी मैं मतलब ट्रेड नहीं ले सकता, लेकिन आप लोगों के साथ अगर मुझे कोई भी यहाँ पे ट्रेड मिलती है तो मैं आप लोगों के साथ इंशाल्लाह ज़रूर शेयर करूँगा। तब तक न्यूज़ आने दें, फिर देखते हैं क्या होता है।
Between selling on a marketplace and selling with Shopify? When you build a store
अच्छा जी, तो फिलहाल अभी जो है 7 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं न्यूज़ में। न्यूज़ को आने दें। तो एक बार न्यूज़ अगर आ जाए तो देखते हैं कि मार्केट का बिहेवियर क्या होने वाला है। अच्छा जी, तो बाकी 5 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं लाइव में। लाइव को आने देते हैं। उसके बाद देखते हैं कि मार्केट का जो बिहेवियर है क्या होने वाला है। बाकी इस टाइम अगर कोई बंदा कहता है कि बाय या सेल, तो सीधी सीधी एक प्रिडिक्शन है। उसके बारे में किसी को कोई गारंटी नहीं सिवाय यूएसए के गवर्नमेंट के अलावा। जब तक गवर्नमेंट जो है न्यूज़ जो है रिलीज़ नहीं करती, तब तक हम कुछ भी नहीं कह सकते।
Up by 50 basis points. We saw a huge rise in 10-year yields, and people said, oh, they made a policy error. Well, why wouldn't this sort of fear of doing that again prevent them from taking a more dovish tilt, at least in the near term?
Because I think back then the market was very excited that they would be on a path to 3%. And then you started to see how the election was going to evolve. You saw the policies coming out of that, and people quickly reversed, we're going to 3% to, you know what, we'll probably stay in the 4 somewhere. And that got priced into the market, and the Treasury market adjusted to that. I think it was that simple. I think actually the Treasury market's in pretty good tune with the Fed. The Fed's in pretty good tune with the data. The question is, what will the data be 3 to 6 months from now? The sentiment, or will it all have changed yet again?
My head hurts with the dots discussion. Kathy Jones, save me here. With the unusualness of the moment, what do you do with a portfolio duration or maturity? How do you nudge that? Which way do you move?
We're pretty much hugging the benchmark. So for us, the benchmark is the ag. It's around 6 years. You get a 460, 465 yield on that, all investment grade, high quality. I think it's a pretty good baseline. If you're a risk taker, maybe use a pop in yields to extend duration a bit, because we do see the economy slowing down in the second half. But, we're not ready to do that. And we're saying up in credit quality because we are seeing a deterioration under the surface in some of the weaker credits. So we're just kind of hugging the benchmark and waiting to see what happens.
Hey, Kathy, appreciate your time this afternoon. As always, Kathy Jones of Charles Schwab alongside Aditya Bharve of Bank of America. That decision 2 minutes away. Bob Michael, just a final word going into that decision.
What I heard from Kathy is they're buying bonds because, like us, they're seeing net inflows to the bond market. So you can be neutral, you're still buying bonds. I like the bond market here. We're buyers on backup in yields and credit spreads.
I imagine you're not alone saying that. Is there this wall of money that people talk about? Sounds a little cliche, but is there a wall of money waiting for any backup in bond yields?
Yes. All kinds of pools of investors are under-allocated to public fixed income.
Seen a massive sentiment shift to Europe and other parts of the bond market, haven't we, in the past year or so? This one's a big one. This really is a big decision. This is a tough decision, not because they're going to move 25, 50 basis points. It's not about that this time around. It's about how you navigate these policy changes, this effort to push a global realignment driven out of Washington, D.C. You've got to try and gauge the response of other actors, China, Europe. You've got to understand what it means for markets, consumer expectations, how that's going to translate into things like inflation, growth over the next several months, and somehow put out projections for the world to interrogate.
Which people will have to understand is something of a dartboard throwing darts at it. Some of the questions, and I wrote down a whole host of them that I have for Fed Chair Jay Powell today. One of them is, are you more worried about stagflation-like conditions today than you were on January 29th? And if so, why? What has changed? And see how that gets navigated.
I look at their dual mandate quickly here, John. The dual mandate, it's all about labor, and it's moving the second derivative of some of those series. Bernanke would
अच्छा जी, तो न्यूज़ टाइम हो गया है।
This is a three-part act. In about 10 seconds time, you get two parts. You get
चलें जी, न्यूज़ जो है कोई अच्छी नहीं आई, पिछले की तरह ही है। 4.50 उसकी जो न्यूज़ है वही आई है। तो उस हिसाब से अगर देखें तो फ़िलहाल गोल्ड के वाले से अभी कुछ नहीं कह सकते। बाकी जो प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस है वो तकरीबन 11:30 बजे। तो फ़िलहाल अभी हमें बिहेवियर देखना है मार्केट का। इसके अलावा इस टाइम अभी हम कुछ नहीं कर सकते, किसी किस्म की जल्दबाजी नहीं करनी और बेवजह थोड़ी ये कैंडल को अपसाइड देख के धोखे लगाना स्टार्ट ना कीजिएगा, ना ही बाय साइड के लिए बैठिएगा। अगर इस जोन को मार्केट जो है अभी ब्रेक करती है तो चांस है कि मार्केट कॉन्फ्रेंस के हवाले से अभी मार्केट बाय की तरफ चली जाएगी, लेकिन फिर भी वेट करें, कोई भी जल्दबाजी ना करें।
Are roughly in balance, now saying the committee is attentive to the risks on both sides of its dual mandate. They emphasize that by saying uncertainty around the economic outlook has increased. That's reflected in the dot plot. 8 members now see one cut or 2 cuts or fewer. The median stays at 2 cuts with 2 more for 2026. The Fed, beginning in April, will slow its balance sheet runoff to $5 billion a month from $25 billion for treasuries. It will retain the $35 billion cap on mortgage redemptions. They don't attribute the change to anything, not to the debt ceiling, but we would expect Chair Powell to talk about that in his news conference. But the change in the runoff drew a dissent from Governor Chris Waller, who approved of the no change in policy rates, but dissented on the idea of slowing the balance sheet runoff.
Mike McKee, there's so much to work through here. Appreciate your time, sir. Apparently stagflation is bullish. We'll get to that in a moment. We are firmer in the stock market by 0.6% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, we're up by 0.8. Mike went through the forecasts and the revisions. Let's do that again, because these are significant changes. Let's focus on 2025 and look at the median projection. The change in real GDP. The projection now, 1.7%, down from 2.1% previously, those forecasts made back in December. Unemployment up to 4.4%. The previous forecast was 4.3. Core PCE 2.8. The previous projection 2.5. And the median dot unchanged. So Lisa, what we've got here is the Federal Reserve essentially saying inflation is going to be higher than we thought it would be. Growth is going to be weaker than we thought it would be. And as for policy, Well, policy doesn't change. That is the stagflationary mix in the forecast that some people were anticipating.
Because we've heard it from all across Wall Street. If they hadn't done this, that would be sort of surprising, since they seem to be reflecting a general sentiment out there. Key question. How are they going to explain why? What has changed? Given the fact that, yes, we've gotten data that has come down, but we haven't necessarily seen a big spike up in inflation. And depending on what inflation expectations you've seen, you haven't necessarily seen them go up that much either. I do think it's interesting about quantitative tightening. I do think it's interesting about Fed Waller dissenting. And I'd like to hear a whole lot more. I also think it's interesting you're not seeing a huge reaction from the 10-year yield on that.
He's running. Talked about that a few times. We'll come back to that later. If you don't know what we're talking about, Jim Bianco has thoughts, I'm sure. He joins us in just a second. Let's turn to the bond market. Bond yields were higher going into this decision. They are now just about unchanged, around 430. So we haven't broken out that range, that very tight trading range over the past few weeks on a 10-year maturity. The 2-year at 4.03%. There's a lot of conflicting stories, a lot of cross currents to this decision here, Lisa. You've got stagflationary mix in the forecast. The median dot remains the same, implies 2 cuts for 2025. And then you're slowing down the balance sheet runoff at the same time. This is going to be a really tough news conference to navigate for Chairman Powell. With those forecasts, it gets harder.
Especially because he's not giving any explanation as to why they are pausing quantitative tightening. He has to explain why they are changing their forecast and why they haven't changed how many times they expect to cut rates. How do they balance these two risks at a time where, again, stagflationary-like scenarios are the worst-case scenario for a central bank?
Buried in the headlines is a single one. FOMC median this year unemployment projection rises to 4.4%. The moment that overshoots, the dialogue changes. I don't know, with all of our esteemed guests, John, I'll let you decide. Is 4.5 a trigger point? Is 4.7? To me, it's a round number, 5%. But I'm sorry, 4.4% is emotionally, for President Trump, a long way from where we are right now.
Tom, I think we have to be really patient about how we process and internalize what the Federal Reserve is telling us this afternoon. I often say when we get a Fed decision or economic data, these are the market moves, let's see if they stick. These are the market moves, we'll see if they stick. I don't think the market moves right now should shape the narrative too much. Just take a step back, don't even look at the market. The Federal Reserve is telling you that they've had to dial back growth expectations, but that won't lead to lower interest rates. The Federal Reserve is telling you that on the margin, unemployment's going to be a little bit higher, but relative to what we thought back in December, that doesn't mean additional interest rate cuts. On the surface, looking at that alone, and I know there's a lot more going on here, that's a hawkish decision from the Federal Reserve.
On the margins, this is them saying that they need to prioritize inflation just as much as unemployment rising to 4.4%. And that right now, the market's grappling with at a time where inflation is as much of a risk to asset prices as is potentially downward growth.
I'm looking, John, a message just in from Drew Mattis of MetLife. He's getting closer to being a net buyer of treasuries again. I told him to call Bob Michael.
Bob Michael's with us now from JP Morgan Asset Management. Bob, we gave you some time to go over this one. What are your thoughts?
This is a dovish Fed. When I look at how they changed their expectations, they lowered GDP by more than they raised inflation. That's tip number one. You look at unemployment, they're worried about how businesses will respond. So they raised unemployment. That's tip number two. And then they said, I believe, uncertainty around economic activity increases. Think if you're in corporate America and you hear that, what do? You stop spending and you hold all the capital you can. This is a very dovish Fed. Well, I think that they're comfortable with the 2 dots where they are. It's 2 more rate cuts. I'll take it.
Jim Bianco of Bianco Research can get in on the conversation. Jim, I'd love your thoughts on this situation. We talked about it, lots of cross currents, lots to process. Where do you stand on what we've just heard?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Bob was saying about that nominal GDP came down. In other words, they cut the real growth more than they raised the inflation rate. But I think ultimately, I've termed this the meeting before the meeting. I think the most important meeting for the Fed is going to be the May 7th meeting. All right, they cut their forecast. We've got the histrionics of a 10% correction. We're all talking about tariffs. If we get to that May 7th meeting and they do not find a reason to cut rates, they're not going to find a reason to cut rates this year, unless something else comes that we don't expect. And I think when you look at the market right now, at least the initial reaction in Fed Fund futures and the like is that they're not going to cut rates at that May 7th meeting. So we'll have to see what transpires in the press conference that kind of gets us going there. Because like I want to emphasize it again, what more would they need to see at May 7th that they already haven't if they go to that meeting and they don't cut it? So this is the meeting before the meeting.
There's also a question about just how much inflation expectations are going to tick up and what the signal is from them pausing the quantitative tightening program. Jim, it's in the weeds. We've heard from Kathy Jones that's just a technical adjustment. It's not going to make that big of a difference. Does it represent something more to you?
Yeah, only in the extent that a lot of the quantitative tightening, the rolling off of the balance sheet was that they weren't buying mortgages to the extent that they used to. And that has become a bit of a political football for the Fed. In the era of high mortgage rates, they seem to be backing off and trying to support lower mortgage rates. Well, now they're trying to do that by, so I think that there is going to be, some issues with that, and there's going to be some discussion about why they did it. And I hope he's asked, and I'd like to hear a good explanation for why, because obviously it wasn't a unanimous decision. Fed Governor Waller dissented from it.
Jim Bianco, to give you a victory lap on the last time the White Sox won 3 games in a row, you nailed transitory inflation. You nailed the stickiness of it. If we get inflation to come in with this low growth estimate, how will the Fed respond to that?
I'm afraid, that it's going to be more like what we saw in September. That when the Fed, I'm in the camp that when the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points in September, the bond market looked at it and said, look, you're not serious about inflation, so we're not serious about the bond market, and yields went up. I know we try to blame Trump and the Trump policies and that, but it turned right on that Fed meeting when Harris was leading in the polls and interest rates started to go up. So it was more about the Fed meeting and them being aggressive. So if they're going to respond to the idea that the economy is slowing but inflation is staying sticky by cutting rates or threatening to cut rates, they run the risk of the same reaction again. You want to produce 5% in the 10-year rate? Well, then, cut rates when the market is still worried about inflation. And I'll remind everybody, we've had 46 straight months now of core inflation above 3%. And the Fed keeps talking about their target being below 2. We can't get core inflation below 3, let alone get to their target of 2%. And if they start cutting rates again, they run a very big risk of a bad reaction.
Jim, how does an explosion of fiscal spending in places like Germany and China complicate the story when suddenly there's a lot more competition around the world for the dollars or the currency to fund people's deficits?
Well, I think the first thing you'd have to look at is, the example that we had with the CARES Act in 2020 with an explosion of fiscal spending was inflation. And I think you're probably going to see an uptick of inflation in Europe, and that's going to reverberate through everywhere. Remember, when we had our uptick in inflation, so did they. I suspect if they have an uptick of inflation, it will come back to us, not $1 for dollar, but we'll see an upward push of an inflation. And I also think that that's also going to attract capital to Europe. They've got, they got down to like a 10 PE on a lot of their stock markets where we were above 20. So they're a cheap market, and now they're stimulating, and they're willing, and at least equity investors will be willing to tolerate more inflation, but bond investors won't. So I think you'll start to see higher, you'll see those higher rates in Europe continue, and maybe.
अच्छा जी, तो अगर जहाँ तक की बात है फ़िलहाल जो लाइव चली है उसको देखते हुए अभी हम आपको यही बताएंगे कि इस टाइम तक जो न्यूज़ हमने देखी तो डॉलर जो है इस टाइम वीक हो चुका है। तो जाहिर सी बात है, जब डॉलर वीक होता है तो आपको पता है गोल्ड भैया जो है ऊपर चले जाते हैं। लेकिन जो मेन कॉन्फ्रेंस होने वाली है, पोवेल साहब जो आके कुछ थोड़ी बहुत बातें करेंगे हमारे साथ, वो 11:30 बजे करेंगे। तो उस हवाले से अगर देखें तो फ़िलहाल कोई भी मार्केट में इस टाइम हाथ ना डालें, क्योंकि जब तक वो भाई आकर नहीं बताएंगे कोई भी ऐसी चीज़, तब तक आपको कोई भी इसमें ट्रेड वगैरह नहीं लेनी। आपको फ़िलहाल अपने इमोशंस पे कंट्रोल रखना है, थोड़ा वेट करें। बाकी जी 15 या 17 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं पोवेल साहब को आने में, वो भी आ जाएं तो फिर देखते हैं क्या होता है। उसके बाद जी हम डिसाइड कर सकते हैं कि मार्केट जो है किस तरफ जा सकती है और उसका जो है डायरेक्शन क्या रह सकता है, बाय साइड के लिए या सेल साइड के लिए। लेकिन मैंने जहाँ तक अभी देखा तो डॉलर अभी जो है वीक हो चुका है। तो उस हवाले से गोल्ड जो है बाय के लिए चला जा सकता है। और उसके अलावा जो सारे दिन जो मैंने आज ये जोन एक ड्रा किया था, जहाँ तक मैं आपको बार बार कह रहा था ये हमारा टारगेट, ये हमारा टारगेट, लेकिन मार्केट फेक ब्रेकआउट देने के बाद बार बार वहाँ से नीचे आ रही थी और हमारा एसएल जो है उठा रही थी। वो जोन था 50 का। तो आपके सामने ही था कि मार्केट बार बार हमें ऐसे ही धोखा दे रही थी। तो मुझे उम्मीद है कि ये एफओएमसी जो है ये शायद इसको बाय में ले जाए और हमारे उस टारगेट तक पहुंचने में हेल्प करे। लेकिन फ़िलहाल वेट करते हैं, देखते हैं क्या होता है। वैसे यहाँ पे प्राइस एक्शन के हवाले से डबल बॉटम भी बन रहा था, अगर आप सही से देखें 15 मिनट में। और अगर 1 आवर के हिसाब से भी देखें तो 1 आवर के हिसाब से यहाँ भी डबल बॉटम ही बन रहा है। अगर डबल बॉटम की रिस्पेक्ट होती है तो अच्छी बात है। और रही बात जी यूएस ऑयल की, जो हमने ट्रेड ली थी, तो मैंने आपको यहाँ पे ये लाइन ड्रा करके दिखाई थी कुछ देर पहले, जो है मैंने उसको रिमूव कर दिया जी। तो मैंने आपको कहा था कि यहाँ से हाफ लॉट आप अपनी कट करके ब्रेक इवन सेट कर देना। तो अभी ज़ाहिर सी बात है डॉलर वीक हुआ है, तो आप देख सकते हैं इसमें ऑयल में जो है पहले यूएस लिखा हुआ है, तो पहले जो है डॉलर है, उसके बाद ऑयल है। तो फिलहाल डॉलर वीक होने की वजह से ये जो है डाउन साइड की तरफ जा रहा है, तो जाहिर सी बात है हमारा ब्रेक इवन कर देगा। और वैसे भी आज बहुत मेहनत के बाद जाके यूएस ऑयल ने हमें थोड़ा सा प्रॉफिट दिया। इसको अभी हम थोड़ा नहीं कह सकते, लेकिन अच्छा प्रॉफिट था। तकरीबन मैंने जो इसमें यहाँ पे अगर मेजर करते हैं तो 60 पिप बनते हैं, लेकिन मुझे जो इसने प्रॉफिट दिखाया वो तकरीबन 95 पिप का इसने दिखाया था। तो मैंने उसमें से हाफ लॉट जो है वो बुक कर दी थी, बाकी ब्रेक इवन है। तो अभी कुछ देर में ये ब्रेक इवन कर देगा, उससे अभी मुझसे कोई मसला नहीं है। और बाकी डॉलर वीक है तो उस हवाले से अभी जो है ये जिस टेक्निकल के हिसाब से जा रहा था यूएस ऑयल, अब उसको ये मुश्किल से फॉलो करे। और यहाँ पे आप खुद देख सकते हैं कि इस टाइम इसने जो है एक डबल बॉटम जो है बना दिया है। ठीक है जी। तो डबल बॉटम बनाने की वजह से यहाँ से मार्केट जो है तकरीबन अब गिर सकती है। और न्यूज़ के हवाले से भी आपको पता है ये मार्केट यहाँ से गिरेगी। और अगर यहाँ से गिरती है फॉर एग्जांपल मार्केट, तो मैं आपको बता देता हूँ कि कैसे आपको यहाँ से ट्रेड लेनी है। तो अगर मार्केट थोड़ा सा इधर रिट्रेस करे इस जोन तक, यहाँ पे आप अपनी ट्रेड को लगा सकते हैं। ठीक है जी। शार्ट पोजीशन ऐसे आप ओपन करें। एसएल जो है आपका यहाँ तक होना चाहिए, टारगेट आपका जो है ये वाला है। ठीक है जी। जो प्रीवियस लो है 1:5 की ये ट्रेड बन रही, तो मैंने आपको ये अच्छी एक ट्रेड दे दी है। रही बात इस ब्रेक इवन की, तो जब करे इसकी मर्जी, में अभी कुछ नहीं कह सकता। ठीक हो गया। बाकी 15 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं न्यूज़ में, तो न्यूज़ को आने देते हैं। पॉवेल साहब आए, बातें करें कुछ हमारे साथ, उसके बाद देखते हैं कि मार्केट का जो है बिहेवियर क्या रहने वाला है। लेकिन इस टाइम हम जो है कुछ भी नहीं कर सकते, और ना ही इस टाइम बेवजह अभी हमें ट्रेड लेनी चाहिए, क्योंकि आपको तो पता है इस टाइम अगर बेवजह हम ट्रेड लेंगे तो कितना नुकसान हो सकता है। और जैसे कि मैंने कहा कि डॉलर जो है वीक हुआ, तो उस हवाले से अभी मार्केट जो है मैसिव पंप की तरफ ही जा रही है। और इसमें आप देख सकते हैं कि पिछली प्रीवियस कैंडल में इसमें बहुत हाई वॉल्यूम ऐड हुआ। तो देखते हैं कि मार्केट क्या करती है, थोड़ा सा काइंडली वेट करें।
Or the other, or stand hold. They'd rather stop short on rate cuts and wait for policy and to see how that plays out through the economy. That's going to be a very pregnant pause. I don't think there's any chance that they cut in May. I think that's a very low probability. We do not have a cut this year until early 2026 because of the underlying upward pressure on tariffs. Now, much we'll find out, more information on that on April 2nd. And then, of course, it matters in terms of how it actually plays out. The Fed does not want to front run this. I think that's the most important message that Jay Powell is going to try to point out, that he's only going to react to whatever happens in the economy that keeps him out of the political fray.
Diane, we talked to a lot of people in fancy zip codes who tell us things are slowing down, whether it's Morgan Stanley or UBS today. What do you see where you are, from Aurora over to Gary, up to Waukegan? I mean, within the Goolsby district, what are you actually seeing in labor dynamics?
We are seeing some slowdown. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to a lot of small businesses in the area as well. And one of the things we're really starting to see is things like that pullback in restaurant spending that we saw in retail sales, this sort of hesitancy, builders complaining that people aren't walking through, doing the, you know, seeing the kind of looking for houses that they had seen out there before, not seeing the foot traffic they once did. Those are things that are important because that's sort of reflective of some of the consumer confidence numbers. Now, we've also seen a lot of front running of tariffs, and every company I know out there is trying to hedge their tariff situation. That's already pushed up costs of many things even before the tariffs that we have currently went into effect, and they're now having to deal with that as well. And that's a very challenging environment. There is a real chill, of course, in terms of what is the carve out for USMCA, and many companies that technically qualify for USMCA and the carve-out that they hope to get in the auto industry on April 2nd, they did not apply for the permission on that because there just wasn't a reason to before, and now they have to be certified. So this scramble in terms of, I'll tell you, our tax and customs group, and I'm working with them constantly, and logistics are absolutely slammed right now.
Diane, there was a time when Tom and me got in trouble for calling an ECB news conference a snooze fest. We're not going to get in trouble this time around because this won't be a snooze fest. This is gripping stuff, Diane. I just wonder from your perspective what you would ask Chairman Powell as that news conference begins in 10, 11 minutes' time.
I think the most important thing to ask, because he's not going to be able to tell you what the actual reaction function is, but we know they're doing scenarios. He talks about scenarios. We need to sort of push him on what are the scenarios that the Fed's looking at right now, and what does that mean for policy?
John, Ian Lincoln, publishing at Bank of Montreal, BMO, he supports John Farrow's view. The distribution of projections shifted hawkishly.
Look, the fact we're having a debate about it means that Chairman Powell needs to address something in about 10 minutes' time. Dan Swank says it's hawkish of KPMG. Dan, appreciate your time as always. Bob Michael of JP Morgan Asset Management says it's dovish. Now, maybe we can explain this by saying that there are different seats here. One is an economist, just talking about things as they see them. Another is a market participant saying, well, this is what was priced and this is what was expected in financial markets. And maybe you can make that argument this afternoon. But I do think if you take the market out of it, Lisa, if I just looked at those forecasts, if you told me they'd be downgrading growth expectations and maintaining interest rates, in fact implying that maybe it'll be 2 cuts or less, not 2 cuts or more, based on where the median dot and the distribution of dots was last time around, I think we'd all agree that that was a touch hawkish.
I think the vocabulary has changed. And frankly, this scenario is gotten away from the vocabulary that we used to use in a very different time. If you're talking about stagflationary-like environments, suddenly the definition of hawkish and dovish takes on a very different approach.
The rules have changed. Matt Lazzetti joins us now of Deutsche Bank. Matt, welcome to the program. We've got a split decision here. You're going to be the break-in vote. Matt, where do you go? Is this dovish or hawkish this afternoon? What is this?
I would love to be the two-handed economist at this point, just telling you it's either hawkish or dovish. I think, given the downgrade to growth and the increase in the unemployment rate, the fact that you saw an upward shift in the dots is kind of clearly a hawkish signal. At the same time, the fact that the Fed is telling you that they are cutting rates a median expectation 2 times this year, with core PC inflation that's 80 basis points above their target and growth that's essentially around potential, kind of continues to signal that there's a dovish bias there. So I think there's kind of clear elements of both of these here. I think the market's view is it's not as hawkish as was anticipated. I think there was a fear of a median of 1 rate cut for today, and so far at least that fear was alleviated.
Matt, you expected them to pause their quantitative tightening, this idea of allowing their balance sheet to shrink. Does this actually mean anything other than just a technical adjustment to smooth the gears of Wall Street?
No, I think for the Fed, this is clearly a technical decision. They slowed rather than paused. But again, I think that was kind of a technical decision about how they were going to deal with MBS and the fact that they might have to buy in the secondary market. And so really, this is just the Fed telling the market they're going to be very cautious in dealing with the balance sheet. They don't want to repeat the mistakes of September 2019. And they're going to be just cautious in dealing with how things evolve here.
I'm going to go to strategist John Farrow on this. You can't make this up. Out on Twitter, Ed, thank you so much for this, for John Farrow. My 16-year-old son has saved $500 and wants to invest it. Should he wait till after the press conference? What do you think?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Matt Lazzetti, how do you think the chairman will approach this news conference in 8 minutes' time?
Look, I think he should just be repeating how he's been discussing the outlook, which is there's a lot of uncertainty at this point in time. They still think the economy and labor market are solid. They're in a wait and see approach here, and they're in no hurry to adjust rates. And I think by the May meeting, by the June meeting, they're going to have greater clarity on how some of these policies are working out. They're also going to have greater clarity on the fallout from the big spike in uncertainty that we've had over the past month. So by May or June, I think we should be hopefully in a reduced uncertainty environment with greater clarity about what the policy outlook is.
Matt Lazzetti of Deutsche Bank. Matt, one of the best. Appreciate it, sir. That news conference is about 7 or 8 minutes away. Whatever you think about the decision, you've got to reflect how the market has responded to it. There's always a signal, some information there. And right now, the equity market is firmer off the back of the decision, Lisa. We are firmer by 0.8% on the S&P.
Because they maybe caused quantitative tightening, maybe because they still signaled 2 rate cuts. All I know is on the margins, the bond market is sort of slowly getting around to the same kind of dovish response to this meeting. Again, hard to say what that means, especially given the fact that this news conference is going to be the most important part of this whole 3-part act.
Bob Michael, you've seen a million of these in the past. What's unique about this news conference with Chairman Powell that's just about to start?
I've been watching a couple things. For the last month, we've watched gold go up and flows into short-duration government bond funds, which told us investors were looking for the safest anchor in the storm. While we're seeing equities drift higher today, maybe it's a little bit of relief, we're seeing the same response. Investors are trying to counterbalance that. Gold has turned up. It's about up $5 an ounce. It was down, and money's gone into the Treasury market. This defines the conundrum in market.
अच्छा जी, तो उम्मीद है कि ये सारी बातें आपको समझ नहीं आई होंगी, क्योंकि कुछ बातें तो मुझे भी समझ नहीं आई। और वैसे भी ये अभी सीधी बात है, फ़िलहाल फालतू की बकवास चल रही है इनकी। तो बाकी 6 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं, 11:30 होने दें। मेन बंदा जो हमारे काम का है उसको आने दें, उसको बात करने दें, फिर मैं आपको बताता हूँ कि जी गोल्ड का नेक्स्ट मूव क्या रहने वाला है। लेकिन अभी से जो देखकर मैं आपको ये बता सकता हूँ कि जी गोल्ड साहब जो हैं बाय के लिए जाएंगे, सेल के लिए मुश्किल है। इसकी मतलब जो सिचुएशन देख के लग नहीं रहा कि ये मार्केट जो है सेल के लिए तैयार हो रही है, लेकिन फिर भी वेट करते हैं, थोड़ा सा देखते हैं। बाकी 5 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं, पॉवेल साहब को आने दें, फिर हम बात करते हैं।
Much as we do, and who knows what's going to happen over the next couple months.
Is Fed policy still in a good place?
It's in a great place. It really is. I think it's a miracle. They got us to 4% unemployment, 4% wage growth, 2-ish% GDP, 2.5% inflation from where they were, and now they've been dealt a real problem with a global trade war, which is a stagflationary economy killer.
So I'm going to ask the question slightly differently then, but it's the same one. Is the Federal Reserve in a good place? For any central banker facing downside risk to growth and upside risk to inflation, it's not a good place, is it?
No, I told you, mark your calendar for 2031. That's when the tape of this meeting will be released. It's fascinating. The tension in the room must have been through the roof.
Lisa, regime change. Totally different place for this Federal Reserve to be in compared to where they before. And I remember earlier this week you talked about the contrast between now and the pandemic. And you made the point that in the pandemic, it was easier for the Federal Reserve because they knew what to do. Just respond with lower rates and buy everything. This time around, it's difficult to know how to respond to these kind of shocks.
And frankly, there still is a lot of disagreement about whether some of these tariffs are disinflationary ultimately down the pike. Right now, they have to not overreact at a time where they are very worried about unemployment rates going up because they know how scarring that can be for an economy and the sort of long lags that can hold.
I would point out that whatever anybody's politics, at any time you pick up your cell phone and you look at names 6, 7, 8 newspapers, including Bloomberg News, people are shocked, John, at the cacophony of headlines. I think the Fed is part of that discussion. They have to be incredibly ex post until they see those headlines work out, political headlines.
It's one of those meetings, Tom, where you can sort of create a narrative out of everything here, hawkish or dovish. I do think it's material and something we haven't.
अच्छा जी, तो बाकी 3 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं, पॉवेल साहब को आने दें, उनकी बातें देखकर हम कुछ डिसाइड करते हैं कि हमें क्या करना चाहिए, क्योंकि ये तो ऐसे बात करते रहेंगे इनकी ज़्यादा बातों से हमारा कोई काम नहीं है, फिलहाल वेट करें। बाकी जी 3 मिनट पड़े हुए हैं, पोवेल साहब को आने दें, उसके बाद देखते हैं कि पोवेल साहब क्या कहते हैं डॉलर के हवाले से। उससे पहले अगर हमने कुछ चीज़ें नोट की डॉलर के हवाले से, तो इस न्यूज़ में जी यूएस डॉलर जो था वीक हुआ है। आप लोगों को समझ आई या ना आई, लेकिन चलें वो मैं आपको बता देता हूँ। तो डॉलर भाई जो है स्ट्रॉन्ग नहीं हुए, इस बार वीक हुए। और अभी पोवेल साहब जो आकर बताएंगे, तो उसके बाद हम कुछ डिसाइड कर सकते हैं। और जी चलें, अगर इसको देखते हैं हम ऑयल को, तो ऑयल में इतना कोई अच्छा मूव नहीं है, लेकिन ये मैंने नोट किया कि जी जो ऑयल है ये बिल्कुल सुस्त है, इसमें इतनी कोई ताकत नहीं है। ये जहाँ भी जा रहा है ऊपर की तरफ या नीचे की तरफ, तो ये मतलब बहुत अच्छा टाइम उसमें ले रहा है। अभी ये देखें तकरीबन इसने 15 घंटे यहाँ लिए, ठीक है जी, 11 घंटे जी। और इसने सुबह से यहाँ तक के लिए 8 घंटे लिए। तो ये जो ऑयल साहब हैं ये काफ़ी डाउन तबीयत के मालिक हैं, इसमें इतना कोई हाल नहीं। जैसे गोल्ड है तो इसमें फिर कुछ ना कुछ जो है फिर भी मूव अच्छे होते हैं और जल्दी ये कवर कर लेता है हर चीज़ को। हाँ, ये भी है कि ये जल्दी हमारे असल भी उठा लेता है और अच्छा खासा हमें नुकसान भी देके जाता है। तो उससे तो हमें घबराना नहीं है, आपको पता है, ऐसे लगता है हमें मज़ा आता है। बाकी फ़िलहाल ऑयल का हमने नोट किया कि ऑयल ऑयल जो है कितना लेज़ी टाइप बंदा है, इसमें कोई खासियत ऐसी हमें नज़र नहीं आ रही। बाकी जी 1 मिनट पड़ा हुआ है, पोवेल साहब को देखें।
I think it's a combination of both, and I think it's also going to do from their survey of small
तो
and
जी
mid-sized businesses, see what they're going to do with the price increases and see how much of those they'll push.
पावेल साहब भी
All of this will be
अभी
incredibly important.
आने
The
वाले
chairman of
हैं,
the
वेट
Federal
करें
Reserve
देखें।
with a very challenging news conference. That news conference begins right now.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. The economy is strong overall and has made significant progress toward our goals over the past 2 years. Labor market conditions are solid, and inflation has moved closer to our 2% longer run goal, though it remains somewhat elevated. In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We also made the technical decision to slow the pace of decline in the size of our balance sheet. I'll have more to say about these decisions after briefly reviewing economic developments. Economic activity continued to expand at a solid pace in the fourth quarter of last year, with GDP rising at 2.3%. Recent indications, however, point to a moderation in consumer spending following the rapid growth seen over the second half of 2024. Surveys of households and businesses point to heightened uncertainty about the economic outlook. It remains to be seen how these developments might affect future spending and investment. In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects GDP to rise 1.7% this year, somewhat lower than projected in December, and to rise a bit below 2% over the next 2 years. In the labor market, conditions remain solid. Payroll job gains averaged 200,000 per month over the past 3 months. The unemployment rate at 4.1% remains low and is held in a narrow range for the past year. The jobs to workers gap has held steady for several months. Wages are growing faster than inflation and at a more sustainable pace than earlier in the pandemic recovery. Overall, a wide set of indicators suggests that conditions in the labor market are broadly in balance. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. The median projection for the unemployment rate in the SEP is 4.4% at the end of this year and 4.3% over the next 2 years. Inflation has eased significantly over the past 2 years, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer-run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.5% over the 12 months ending in February, and that excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.8%. Some near-term measures of inflation expectations have recently moved up. We see this in both market and survey-based measures, and survey respondents, both consumers and businesses, are mentioning tariffs as a driving factor. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 2.7% this year and 2.2% next year, a little higher than projected in December. In 2027, the median projection is at our 2% objective. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. At today's meeting, the committee decided to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5%. Looking ahead, the new administration is in the process of implementing significant policy changes in 4 distinct areas: trade, immigration, fiscal policy, and regulation. It is the net effect of these policy changes that will matter for the economy and for the path of monetary policy. While there have been recent developments in some of these areas, especially trade policy, uncertainty around the changes and their effects on the economic outlook is high. As we parse the incoming information, we're focused on separating the signal from the noise as the outlook evolves. As we say in our statement, in considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance, and we are well positioned to wait for greater clarity. In our SEP, FOMC participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. An admittedly challenging exercise at this time in light of considerable uncertainty. The median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 3.9% at the end of this year and 3.4% at the end of next year, unchanged from December. While these individual forecasts are always subject to uncertainty, as I noted, uncertainty today is unusually elevated. And of course, these projections are not a committee plan or a decision. Policy is not on a preset course. As the economy evolves, we will adjust our policy stance in a manner that best promotes our maximum employment and price stability goals. If the economy remains strong and inflation does not continue to move sustainably toward 2%, we can maintain policy restraint for longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we can ease policy accordingly. Our current policy stance is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face in pursuing both sides of our dual mandate. At today's meeting, we also decided to slow the pace of decline in our balance sheet. Since we began balance sheet runoff, our securities holdings have declined by more than $2 trillion. While market indicators continue to suggest that the quantity of reserves remains abundant, we have seen some signs of increased tightness in money markets. Beginning in April, the monthly cap on Treasury redemptions will be lowered from $25 billion to $5 billion. Consistent with the committee's intention to hold primarily Treasury securities in the longer run, we are leaving the cap on agency securities unchanged. This action has no implications for our intended stance of monetary policy and should not affect the size of our balance sheet over the medium term. The committee also continued its discussions as part of our 5-year review of our monetary policy framework. At this meeting, we focused on labor market dynamics and our maximum employment.
Oh, I'll do that right now in QuickBooks. Just
involving a wide range of parties, including Fed Listens events around the country and a research conference in May. Throughout this process, we will be open to new ideas and critical feedback, and we will take on board lessons of the last 5 years in determining our findings. We intend to wrap up the review by late summer. The Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions.
Howard.
अच्छा जी, तो पोवेल साहब अपनी सारी बातें कर गए। अभी कुछ लोग ऐसे होंगे मेरी तरह जिनको कोई समझ नहीं आई होगी कि आखिर उसने बात क्या की, अब उसका इम्पेक्ट क्या आने वाला है, क्या हो सकता है। तो जी फ़िलहाल जो डॉलर है वो इतना कोई वीक भी नहीं हुआ है, इतना कोई स्ट्रॉन्ग भी नहीं हुआ, कुछ वीक हुआ है। तो उसकी वजह से गोल्ड से अभी हम जो है नेक्स्ट मूव एक्सपेक्ट कर सकते हैं तकरीबन 3050 से लेकर 3070 तक, और वहाँ से गोल्ड में शायद डंप आना स्टार्ट हो जाए, और वो जो डंप होगा तकरीबन 2940 तक भी हो सकता है, क्योंकि डेली टाइम फ्रेम के हवाले से अगर देखें हम लोग या 4 आवर के हवाले से देखें तो ऑर्डर ब्लॉक हमें यही मिलता है और एक स्ट्रॉन्ग लेवल भी है। तो उसी वजह से फ़िलहाल तो अभी हम ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं कह सकते इसके बारे में, लेकिन गोल्ड का फ़िलहाल जो है न्यूज़ के हवाले से तो गोल्ड जो है जी बाय चला जाएगा। फ़िलहाल यहाँ से जो है गोल्ड साहब बाय के लिए ही है। सेलिंग अभी मुझे नहीं नज़र आ रही इसमें। तो अगर यहाँ से कोई भाई जो है बाइंग करना चाहे तो वो तकरीबन अगर बाइंग करना चाहता है तो बाइंग जी आपकी होगी यहाँ से, ठीक है जी। इससे आपका यहाँ टारगेट आपका ये वाला है, ठीक है, 57 तक आपका टारगेट रहने वाला है, और तकरीबन एसएल जो है 39 के पास होगा। तो ये मैंने आपको बाय के लिए एंट्री बता दी है। अभी मैं इस ट्रेड के लिए तो बैठा नहीं रहूँगा, और ना ही मैंने खुद ट्रेड लिए, मैं आपको ये बता दूँ, क्योंकि मुझे जो है फंडेड हमारी जो कंपनी होती है उसकी वजह से मैं नहीं ले सकता, क्योंकि ये हमारे रूल के ख़िलाफ़ है कि मैं न्यूज़ ट्रेडिंग करूँ। उन्होंने मना किया हुआ है 5 मिनट के बाद करनी है या 5 मिनट पहले करनी है, लेकिन इस टाइम मुझे बिल्कुल नहीं करनी, क्योंकि ये इनका कोई भरोसा नहीं होता। ये फिर भी बेवजह भी आपको जो है एक रूल ब्रेक करने की वजह से आपको अकाउंट में वापस दे देते हैं और आपका प्रॉफिट काउंट नहीं होने देते। तो इस वजह से मुझे कोई रिस्क नहीं लेना है इस टाइम। बाकी मैंने आपको एंट्री बता दी है, एंट्री यही है बाय साइड के लिए। बाकी इसको भी कल देखेंगे, और इसकी हाफ लॉट जो आपको कट करनी पड़ेगी वो जी करेंगे आप लोग तकरीबन 50 के पास, जिसके लिए सारा दिन हमने इंतज़ार किया। वही 50 वहाँ तक अगर आए हाफ लॉट को कट करें, ब्रेक इवन को सेट कर देना। बाकी यही ट्रेड है इस टाइम, और इसके अलावा मैं कोई ट्रेड नहीं देने वाला। मैं आपको बताता चलूँ जी, इसका जो एसएल बन रहा है तकरीबन 43 पिप का है, और जो उसका टारगेट है वो 130 पिप का बन रहा है, ठीक है जी। तो मैंने आपको ट्रेड दे दी है, जैसे कि मैंने कहा था कि मैं लाइव आऊँगा एफओएमसी की न्यूज़ के टाइम, तो मैं लाइव भी आया, मैंने आप लोगों के साथ ये ट्रेड भी शेयर कर दी। अभी आज के लिए इतना ही काफ़ी है, बहुत हो गया, सारा दिन भी हमने लाइव की थी, अब मैं भी थक गया हूँ। तो इंशाल्लाह हम कल मिलते हैं दूसरी लाइव के साथ और न्यू ट्रेड्स के साथ। बाकी फ़िलहाल अभी के लिए इतना ही, ठीक है, टाटा बाय बाय।